Peppa Pig, the new friend. One sunny morning, Peppa and George were playing in the garden when a strange piglet approached them. He had pale gray skin, odd eyes with a reddish tint, and a quiet, muffled voice. "Hi, I'm Simon," he said with a smile. "Hi, Simon." "Do you want to play with us?" Peppa asked cheerfully. Simon nodded, but his smile seemed a little off to Peppa. George also looked uneasy, but they decided Simon was just their new friend. At first, they played harmless games. Simon suggested hide and seek, but chose the strangest hiding places, like behind the trees where no one ever hid. When George tried to find him, he suddenly heard a whisper behind him, even though Simon should have been far away. "It's just a game," Simon said, stepping out from the shadows. By evening, things got even stranger. Simon asked to stay for dinner, and Mummy Pig invited him to join. "Are you from the next village?" Mummy Pig asked. "I'm from far away," Simon replied quietly, not taking his eyes off his plate. During dinner, he hardly ate, and instead stared at everyone, especially Peppa. After the family went to bed, Peppa noticed Simon still standing in the garden, staring at the house. The next day, Simon came back. He started inviting Peppa and George to play unsettling games. One game was called Look into the Dark. Simon led them into a dark corner of the shed and said, "Look closely. You'll see something interesting." But instead of something fun, Peppa felt a chilling cold, and Simon's shadow in the darkness seemed to move on its own. One evening, Peppa heard whispering outside her bedroom door. She cautiously peeked out and saw Simon standing in the hallway. His eyes were now glowing red. "Peppa, come with me. We'll be best friends forever," he whispered. Terrified, Peppa called for her parents, but when they arrived, Simon was gone. The next day, George disappeared. All they found was his toy dinosaur, abandoned in the garden. Simon appeared again and said, "Don't worry, he's with me. He's happy." Peppa realized Simon wasn't a friend, but something far more sinister. She tried to make him leave, but he just smiled and said, "You're next."
Peppa Pig, Eyes in the Dark. In the pig family's house, an unusual silence reigned. Lately, George had hardly spoken to his sister. He no longer played with his dinosaur, didn't ask for bedtime stories, and didn't laugh the way he used to. Instead, he spent long hours sitting at the table by the window, clutching a pencil. Sheets of paper were scattered everywhere, on the floor, on the chair, even by the bed. All of them were covered with the same strange symbols, circles with short lines, resembling eyes. "George, what are these drawings?" Peppa asked cautiously. Her brother slowly turned to her. His gaze was unusual, heavy, and somehow too grown up. "You'll find out soon," he whispered, and bent over the papers again. Peppa felt her little hooves grow cold. George was becoming more and more withdrawn, as if his attention was fixed on something she couldn't see. One night, when they were both already lying in their beds, Peppa noticed that George wasn't asleep. He sat right on his sheets, staring at the ceiling. His eyes shimmered strangely, reflecting the moonlight. But there was no warmth in that gleam. It felt as if a bottomless depth was hiding inside them, one she could fall into. "George," Peppa whispered. He didn't answer. He only smiled, in a way he had never smiled before. The next morning, George's bed was empty. His favorite dinosaur lay torn to pieces on the floor. Above his pillow, on the wall, scratches had appeared. Symbols like eyes, as if someone had carved them with a sharp claw. "George!" Peppa called. But the room remained silent. She rushed through the house, searching for her brother in the garden, the kitchen, the living room. But George was nowhere. Everything around her felt too quiet, as if time itself had stopped. When Peppa returned to their room, her eyes fell on the large mirror hanging on the wall. Her heart froze. In the reflection behind her stood George. She spun around quickly. No one was there. But in the mirror, he remained. staring. His eyes glowed with a dim, sickly light, and his lips stretched into a smile. Peppa backed away, and then she noticed that next to George in the reflection sat Labubu. The toy looked almost the same as always, but its eyes flickered with a red glow. On its face lingered the same eerie smile as George's. "George is no more," came a strange voice from the mirror. It was low, drawn out, and echoed both in the room and inside her head. Peppa pressed herself to the wall. The surface of the mirror rippled like water. The shapes of George and Labubu moved forward, toward the glass. Their outlines became sharper, as if they were about to break through. "No!" Peppa screamed. She dashed toward the door, but suddenly froze. In the mirror, her own bed reflected as empty, and on it sat Labubu, very close now, with glowing eyes and a crooked smile. The mirror trembled, and the shadows nearly tore their way out. Peppa squeezed her eyes shut, unable to look. When she opened them again, the mirror was ordinary. The room was silent. Only George's bed remained empty. Later that night, when their parents had gone to sleep, Peppa sat on her bed, staring at the shelf where Labubu now stood again. He looked harmless, soft, and familiar, but now she knew the truth. His eyes were no longer lifeless buttons. In their dim glow flickered the same cold emptiness she had seen in George, and in the corner of the room, near the mirror, a crack was slowly spreading. It widened as if something unseen was watching from behind the wall.
This episode of Peppa Pig was never shown on TV and is a deleted episode of the animated series The Dark Steps in the House. One evening, when the pig family was relaxing in their cozy home, they suddenly felt a strange tension in the air. Mummy Pig was sitting on the sofa with a book, Daddy Pig was fixing something in his workshop, and Peppa and George were playing with toys in another room. But something felt off. There was an unclear sound coming from the hallway, like someone was quietly walking through the house. At first, no one paid much attention, thinking it was just the creaking of the floorboards or some household noise. But with every step, the sound grew clearer and louder. Peppa began to feel uneasy and, curious, she decided to check where the strange footsteps were coming from. When she approached the hallway, she saw that the attic door was slightly open, although it was usually locked. From inside came a strange grinding noise and faint, ominous footsteps. Peppa screamed, calling for Daddy Pig, but no one heard her. She stepped closer to the attic, and suddenly the door closed on its own, leaving her standing in front of it. Then, from behind the door, came a deep, heavy step, as if something large and dark was moving in the attic's dark corners. Peppa's heart froze in her chest. She screamed for help, but realized that her voice didn't carry through the house. It was as if the house had become distorted, and nothing was quite right. Suddenly, the air grew heavy, and Peppa found herself unable to move. It felt like the steps were closing in on her, getting louder and closer with each passing second. She ran back to the room where her parents and George were, but when she entered, she saw them frozen in place, their eyes empty and lifeless, as if they had turned to stone. At that moment, Peppa realized that she couldn't escape the house, and anyone who stayed inside would eventually become petrified. The footsteps were getting closer and closer, and the house felt like it was slowly freezing in time. As Peppa approached the door, she realized it didn't lead to the usual street. It led to another world, a world where footsteps were a sentence, and her family would remain trapped in this house forever. In the final moments, Peppa tried to leave the house, but as she stepped onto the street, she saw her own steps slowing down and turning to stone. In her eyes appeared an emptiness, and she understood that she too had become a part of this world, just like her family. With every step she took, with every glance, her soul froze forever, and the world remained in darkness and shadow. This episode of the animated series, Peppa Pig, has never been shown on TV.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Daddy Pig was in his study. engrossed in his newspaper. But the rustling of the pages sounded like dry, brittle wings. The antique globe on his desk spun slowly on its own, its continents shifting and blurring. A faint, musty smell filled the room. The ink on the newspaper began to bleed, forming strange, cryptic symbols. Daddy Pig seemed oblivious. The bookshelves appeared to lean precariously. A cold draft swept through the room. Peppa tiptoed to the study door. The familiar ticking of Daddy Pig /S watch had morphed into a slow, deliberate thumping. The air grew heavy. The symbols on the newspaper began to glow with a faint, sickly green light. Daddy Pig looked up, his eyes wide and unseeing. He spoke, but his voice was not his own. He gestured towards the globe, which now pulsed with the same green light. The continents on it rearranged themselves into a map of an unknown, terrifying place. The books on the shelves began to fall. The study was no longer a place of quiet contemplation. Peppa backed away, her heart pounding. The thumping of the watch grew louder. The green light intensified. Daddy Pig rose from his chair, his movements stiff and unnatural. The study door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The air grew thick with an unseen presence. The house was no longer a home, but a predator. The finality of her fate hung heavy in the air. The walls seemed to close in. There was no escape, no hope. Only the hungry silence and the unblinking eye of their doom. The house had claimed its prize, and the game was over. For now. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Mummy Pig was preparing dinner, but the food on the table began to move on its own. The carrots wriggled like worms, the potatoes pulsed with a faint, internal light, and the peas rolled off the plate and scurried across the floor like tiny, green insects. The familiar aroma of cooking was replaced by a strange, earthy smell, mixed with something sweet and sickly. Peppa and George watched in horror as the vegetables began to coalesce, forming a grotesque, pulsating mass in the center of the table. It grew larger, slowly taking on a vaguely humanoid shape, with two glowing green eyes emerging from its surface. Mummy Pig, her back turned, continued to hum, oblivious to the monstrous transformation occurring behind her. The kitchen grew cold, and the familiar sounds of cooking were replaced by a faint, squelching noise. The monstrous vegetable creature began to twitch, then to rise, its form dripping with a viscous, green liquid. It let out a low, guttural groan, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards. The kitchen, once a place of nourishment, was now a scene of unimaginable horror. The familiar comfort of their home was replaced by a chilling sense of dread, as the food they were about to eat transformed into a living nightmare. The creature took a step, its root-like feet squelching on the tiled floor. It reached out a tendril, its glowing eyes fixed on Peppa. The house was no longer safe, for a monstrous hunger had awakened within its walls. The familiar comfort of their dinner time had become a terrifying encounter with a sentient, malevolent entity. The food was alive and it was hungry.
This series was lost and never shown on TV. Peppa Pig, the room that wasn't there. The day in the Pig family's house was as usual. Peppa and George were playing in the living room while Mummy Pig was cooking dinner and Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper. Everything was familiar, cozy. But in the evening, something strange happened. When Peppa went upstairs to her room, she noticed a door at the end of the hallway. It had never been there. The house wasn't that big, and Peppa knew exactly where everything was. At the end of the hallway, there had always been just a wall, but now there was a door. Ordinary-looking, wooden, with a round handle. George followed her, looking confused. A cold feeling settled inside Peppa. Maybe Mummy and Daddy had remodeled something. Maybe it had always been there and she just hadn't noticed. But the longer she stared, the more wrong it seemed. She had never heard anyone building anything new. And yet, The door was there. It was calling to be opened. Peppa cautiously reached for the handle. Inside was a room, empty, bare walls, a dusty wooden floor. But the air inside was heavy, stale, as if no one had stepped inside for a very, very long time. Peppa took a step forward. Silence. But there was a feeling like someone was there, like someone had just been standing in that corner, and moved the moment she entered. George tugged at her hoof, but Peppa didn't move. Something was wrong. They couldn't hear the television from the living room. They couldn't hear their parents' footsteps. Only silence. And then, a step. Peppa turned sharply, but the room was empty. Complete suffocating stillness. And then, the door began to close, slowly, soundlessly, as if someone was pushing it from the other side. Peppa and George lunged for the exit, but too late. The door slammed shut. Darkness. The room had no window, no drafts, not even a crack of light. Only absolute darkness and silence. Peppa yanked at the handle. It wouldn't budge. George curled into a ball, clutching his dinosaur tightly. And then Peppa heard breathing. Deep. Quiet. Not hers. Not George's. Someone else was in this room. Something was standing in the dark. Very close. The vanished house. One morning, Peppa and her family woke up in their usual home. Daddy Pig was warming up breakfast, Mummy Pig was making tea, and George was playing with his toys. Everything was calm, but when Peppa decided to step outside, she noticed something strange. Outside the window, there was no familiar green yard, and the sky looked dull and gray. Peppa went to the door and opened it. There was no sound, no people, just darkness. The yard was gone, and the house itself seemed to be surrounded by a dark, endless space. The walls of the house began to slowly disappear, as if dissolving into the air. Peppa tried to return inside, but the door slammed shut, and everything inside turned dark. She screamed and ran back to her parents, but they were sitting as if nothing had happened. Daddy Pig was still reading the newspaper, and Mummy Pig was still making tea. Peppa tried to tell them what had happened outside, but they didn't hear her. Then Peppa noticed that everyone in the house seemed strange. Daddy Pig no longer laughed, and Mummy Pig wasn't smiling. In search of answers, Peppa decided to step outside again. This time, when she stepped out, she found herself in an empty world. Everything around her was gray, with no trees or familiar buildings. Peppa turned around and saw the house she had lived in disappearing, turning into mist. In panic, she rushed back into the house, but now everything inside was as empty and gloomy as it was outside. Mummy and Daddy Pig were sitting in dark corners, their faces strange and lifeless. Then Peppa realized that her house was gone, and perhaps she was too. There were no traces of her family, nothing familiar. Everything had disappeared. Peppa Pig, uncontrollable growth. It was an ordinary evening in the pig household. The sun was setting, casting warm rays through the windows of the living room. Peppa and George were sitting on the couch, flipping through a book of fairy tales their mother had given them. The atmosphere was calm, almost too perfect. But deep inside Peppa, a strange feeling began to build, as if something wasn't quite right. She put the book down and stretched, gazing out the window. The sky had turned darker, taking on a purple hue, and the first stars were beginning to appear. But as she stared at the darkening sky, she felt a strange sensation in her chest, as if her heart had skipped a beat. It felt like some sort of pressure, almost as if she felt uncomfortably full. Peppa stood up, rubbing her stomach. It felt like she had overeaten at dinner, but that wasn't the case. Her clothes started to feel tight. The sensation of pressure grew stronger, and she noticed something even stranger. She was growing. At first, it was only a little bit. Her legs tingled and her shoes started to feel tight, but she brushed it off as a trick of the mind. However, the strange feeling didn't go away. On the contrary, it only intensified. Her legs began to stretch. Peppa looked down in horror as her legs grew longer and her pants tightened around her body. She gasped, trying to call for her parents, but her voice sounded muffled, as though something was blocking it. And then she kept growing. Her legs stretched further and her body seemed to expand faster and faster. She could feel her arms and head elongating. She reached for the walls, but each movement made her grow even more. Peppa panicked, trying to steady herself, but with every step, she just got bigger. Soon she was taller than the house, and everything around her felt tighter. The ceiling cracked as her head scraped against it. The walls closed in around her, and Peppa couldn't comprehend what was happening. The world around her seemed so small. Even the floor, which had once felt solid, began to crack under her growing weight. With every step, Peppa became bigger, and it was harder and harder to control her body. Her movements were slow and clumsy, and she felt more out of control with each passing second. The furniture fell apart, the walls crumbled, and she couldn't stop growing. Everything around her felt smaller, and she felt like a giant moving through a tiny world. Peppa looked around in horror, trying to make sense of it all, but with each moment she felt more helpless. Her body, once light and agile, was now heavy and uncontrollable. She tried to crouch down, but her massive body didn't obey her. Her clothes and the walls around her squeezed in, and she continued to grow, unable to stop herself. As she was nearly bursting through the roof, she felt the house begin to collapse. The walls broke apart, and the ceiling flew off as if made of cards. Peppa stood there, her gigantic body blocking out everything. What was once her home was now destroyed and gone, crushed under the weight of her own growth. She sat in complete silence, surrounded by the ruins of the house, unable to understand how to return to her original size. Her body didn't obey her, and the world around her seemed too tiny and fragile. This series was lost and never shown on TV. Peppa Pig, voices on the second floor. It was a late evening in the Pig family's house. The wind howled outside, rushing through the dark streets. Rain drummed against the roof, trickling down the windows in thin streams. Everything seemed like a normal rainy night, yet something in the air felt wrong. Peppa and George sat in the living room, wrapped in warm blankets. The television flickered with a silly program, but neither of them could focus on the screen. The house was too quiet. Even the sound of the rain felt muted, as if the walls had thickened. Then they heard it. Voices. They came from upstairs. It sounded like someone was walking on the second floor and talking. But they both knew that Mummy and Daddy Pig had already gone to bed. Their door was closed. There was no one else in the house. Peppa froze. George clutched his dinosaur. The voices were muffled but clear. The words were indistinct, yet it was obvious that someone was speaking. A whisper, a quiet laugh, slow footsteps, the floor creaking under the weight. Peppa lifted her head, staring at the staircase. The second floor was swallowed by darkness. The stairs seemed to stretch endlessly, as if the top step was sinking into a void. The voices didn't stop. They sounded wrong, like someone was pretending to sound familiar, but was failing. The voices grew closer. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. And then they began to descend. Step, pause, step, pause. Something was coming down. Peppa and George didn't move. Their hearts pounded so loudly that it felt like the whole house could hear them. But the worst was yet to come. When it reached the middle of the staircase, the upstairs light flickered. For a brief moment, they saw a shadow, tall, stretched, and completely still. The footsteps continued. The voices were right there. Peppa couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed George's hoof and squeezed her eyes shut. And suddenly, everything stopped. No more footsteps, no more voices, only silence. Peppa slowly opened her eyes. The top of the stairs was empty, but she knew that something was still there. It just didn't want to be seen. This episode of the animated series, Peppa Pig, has never been shown on TV. Peppa Pig. Mom is no longer the same. The day was gray and rainy. The clouds hung low over the pig family's house, the wind shook the trees, and raindrops drummed against the windows. Daddy Pig had gone out on business, and Mummy Pig went shopping, leaving Peppa and George at home. They played in the living room, building towers out of blocks, but something felt off. The house seemed quieter than usual, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for something. Time dragged on. It was getting dark outside, but Mummy Pig still hadn't returned. Then the lock clicked. The children jumped. The door slowly creaked open. Mummy Pig stepped inside, but something was wrong. Her movements were slow, uneven, as if her body had forgotten how to move. Her wet clothes clung to her skin, but she didn't shake off the rain, didn't take off her boots, didn't say a word. She just stood there, unblinking, staring at the children. The living room grew cold. The air thickened with a strange heaviness, like the moment before a storm. Peppa squeezed George's hand. Mummy Pig's eyes weren't the same. The whites had turned too pale, almost gray, and her pupils had dilated so much that her eyes looked like two black voids. But the most terrifying thing was her mouth. It hung slightly open. Her lips twitched as if she was trying to say something but couldn't. Peppa waited for Mummy to speak, but she just stood there. Then, she stepped forward. The floorboards didn't creak. It was as if her feet weren't touching the ground at all. The lights in the room flickered as though the air had thickened, turning heavier. Mummy Pig moved again. But now her movements became unnatural, fluid, like a puppet suspended on strings. Her head tilted slowly, and in the dim light, Peppa noticed something strange. Something was moving beneath her skin. Dark shapes slithered under the surface of her face, as if hundreds of tiny creatures were living inside. Peppa shivered, but the worst came in the next moment. Mummy Pig lunged forward, suddenly like a broken doll. Her whole body jerked forward, and her mouth stretched open wider than should be possible. Peppa heard a sound for the first time. Not a voice, not a whisper, but a chorus of hundreds of voices speaking at once. The house shuddered. The curtains twisted with writhing shadows. The walls cracked, and from the gaps in the floorboards, a black liquid seeped out. Mummy Pig rose above the ground. Her arms elongated, her fingers became too thin, and from her mouth something slipped out, black, writhing, alive. The shadows in the room folded into a single mass and swarmed forward. Peppa screamed, but there was no sound. All she could hear were footsteps coming closer, the footsteps of something that was no longer Mummy Pig.
Peppa Pig, the cracks. It started as just a tiny line, almost invisible in the corner of Peppa's bedroom. She thought it was just a crack in the paint. Maybe someone had bumped into the wall. "Mummy, look," she said that evening, pointing. Mummy Pig glanced over, nodded and said, "The house has probably settled a bit. Nothing to worry about. Daddy will fix it." But Daddy forgot, and the crack stayed. The next day, Peppa noticed it had grown longer. Now it stretched upward slightly, like a tree branch reaching toward the ceiling. "That's strange," she muttered. "Maybe I'm imagining it." But each day, the crack grew, first thin, then a little wider. After a few days, it curved unnaturally, like someone had drawn it with a finger. More cracks appeared nearby, one, then another. "Is our house okay?" Peppa asked Daddy Pig. "Of course," he laughed. "Walls crack sometimes. We'll fix it." They never did. A week later, the whole wall was laced with thin cracks. Some of them vanished during the day, only to return by night. One night, Peppa woke up and saw the crack moving, slightly, as if something inside was breathing. She got out of bed and walked closer, pressed her ear against it. Inside, a sound. Very quiet. Scraping. A knock. Slow. 3 taps. A pause. 2 more. Peppa jumped back. "George?" she whispered. Her brother was asleep, breathing steadily. In the morning, she found a small, dusty scrap of paper beneath the crack, very old, almost falling apart. On it, a single word: open. Peppa didn't tell her parents. She covered the crack with bandages, several layers, then hung a picture over it. But by nightfall, the picture had fallen. The tape was torn away. New lines appeared on the wall, not cracks anymore, almost like letters. She backed away to the door, but the door wouldn't open. Something inside the wall was moving, slowly, like it was exhaling. She screamed. Mummy and Daddy rushed in. It's, Peppa gasped, pointing. But on the wall, nothing, no cracks, no words, just a perfectly smooth surface. You probably had a bad dream, said Mummy Pig gently. Let's try to forget about it. But Peppa couldn't forget, because that night, when she turned to face the wall, she saw movement right where the crack had been, and then a voice, a whisper. I'm almost out, don't turn around.